Hello, and welcome to my research project on turn and talk support between emergent bilinguals and English speaking students by Brooke Orenstein. And this is for TEL 449. So the placement I was at was Michael Collins Elementary School. It is a kindergarten classroom that's gen ed, but we do have some students who have IEPs. There are 21 students and 13 of those students are English language learners. They speak languages like Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and more. So with having so many diverse students in my classroom, it was really interesting to see how those students are able to learn in a classroom, in a gen ed classroom. So within the first couple weeks at my kindergarten placement last semester, I was able to quickly see how diverse the students are. During turn and talks, free time, and more, the students who were English speaking and English language learners struggled to communicate with each other. I wondered how I could support and nurture relationships between the English language learners and English speaking students before I completed student teaching. So some of the things I was observing was during turn and talks where maybe an English language learner was partnered with an English speaking student, there would be a lot of the English speaking student saying, she's not talking to me, or becoming very frustrated when they weren't able to have a meaningful conversation about the content. So I wondered what supports I could provide to them in order to make those turn and talks more purposeful, and then allowing them to use those tools that I give them during turn and talks and use them, for example, outside of recess or during their groups when maybe they go to a different classroom and are working with different students. And so really giving both students the tools to communicate and have meaningful conversations with anyone they may come across. So my research question was, how do I, the student teacher, create communication tools so emergent bilingual students and English speaking students can constructively interact with each other in oral conversations? So as I show you my slides, you'll be able to see how I was able to create supports that were individualized to the students and what they needed, and being able to see what tools were working and maybe what tools I needed to tweak a little bit to better support them. So some of my articles I found was 6 ways to improve turn and talks for student language development. This was an article all about the simple tools and supports you can give to students to support them during these times. So giving sentence starters, so like, I think this because, or I agree because. Having the students learn about active listening. So sometimes I would see the English speaking student speaking the entire time that was the turn and talk, and not even giving the English language learner an opportunity to try and speak. And so really teaching both students that it's we take turns and we need to be active listeners when it's not our turn, and really giving each other the time we need to share what we would like to share. So this gave me a great baseline for the supports I could use with my EL students, and more importantly, my English speaking students, to give them both the supports they need for interacting with everybody, especially because there were so many ELL students in my class who ranged in abilities. So the next article was using pair and group work to develop ELL's oral language skills. So in this article, it touched on more of how we can make those students comfortable during those turn and talks that might be a little more nerve-wracking. So it talked about how using the turn and talks was a great tool because sometimes students feel more uncomfortable during large groups and speaking in front of the entire class. And so making it more of a small group activity for them to share would make them a little more comfortable, and knowing that they're only sharing to one other student rather than the 21 that are in our class. And so another thing it talked about was body language. So making sure that you're giving that student who's speaking your full attention, and you're not trying to talk over them, or you're not turned away from them, but really giving them that eye contact to make them feel like you're listening to what they're saying, and what they're saying is important. And lastly, it talked about how important it is to be sure that students are understanding materials. So if the students aren't understanding, then they can't then use that in a turn and talk. So really making sure I'm using appropriate vocabulary with them and making sure that they're understanding what is being said, so then they can go into their turn and talks and feel more confident. So here was the data collection I used. So the first day I used an emotional assessment, which all these data collections I used, you will see in the next slide. On day 2, I used a field note. Day 3, I used an emotional assessment. Day 4, I used an anecdotal note. Day 5, I used an emotional assessment. Day 6, I used a field note. Day 7, I used an emotional assessment. Day 8, I used anecdotal notes. Day 9, I used the emotional assessment. And day 10, I used the emotional assessment. And you will see me explain those in the next couple slides. So how did I support those students during my research? So here are the things I used. So giving the students fidgets to calm their nerves. I found that a lot of the students were really anxious during these turn and talks. And so giving them something to hold on to, not only during the turn and talk, but during writing or group time or any time that they may feel nervous about the conversation they were going to have or speaking with other students, they could use that. The emotional assessment was a way for me to give the students a slip of paper, and they would fill it out. I had examples on the sheet of paper to show them, oh, this is an example of something you can write if this is how you feel. Since our turn and talk time during shared reading was immediately followed by guided reading, and I had my own guided group I needed to be with, giving them this emotional assessment allowed for me to give it to them, get immediate feedback, and then go and look at all those assessments when they were finished writing them to see how they did in that lesson, how they felt. So another tool I used was having words they might not know on paper visuals. That way they can look at it and say, oh, there was a dog in the story. I can remember that there was a dog because I saw the visual and remembered that there was that in the story. Reviewing the story with them prior to reading seemed to help a lot. So before the day started, I would pull those ELs aside and show them the book they were reading. I would read it to them and have them talk about what they read about and tell them, give them a preview of what we may be discussing during those turn and talks during group time. So that way they could be more prepared and maybe have more time to think about what they wanted to say. I was also checking their journal to see if they were understanding the story. So during guided reading, they would have a journal that would ask them what a question about the context of our shared reading. So whether that was, oh, did you agree with the dad's side of the story or the children's part of the story? So that would be from whatever literature we read that day, and they would have to write down whichever one they agreed with. And so being able to see what they wrote gave me a better understanding of what they understood and maybe how I can better support them in understanding the context of our lessons. I was also walking around with a core board since currently there was only a copy for one of the students who is in speech, who isn't even an English language learner. She is an English speaking student. So I was wondering how I can get it in the hands of all of the students who needed more support in communicating. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to make copies of it, but I was able to walk around and make sure that each one of the students was able to see it and use it if they needed it. So next step would be for all of the students to be able to have a core board in their hand. Then they can use that for writing or our shared reading or any time of the day. It would have all the content of what we were learning that day on that core board. And so that would be a great tool to help them to recall what we were doing. And if they see a puppy on the screen and they can't remember what that word was, they can look on the visual and see that little word and read it themselves, since a lot of them are good readers and they're getting good skills in reading. So this was my emotional assessment that I filled out. So this was immediate feedback I was able to retain from the students, since I wasn't able to go to each one of them and have a long, meaningful conversation, since I needed to go right to my guided group. So some of the students wrote, "I happy." So I took that as the student felt happy after the turn and talk and maybe felt better. The student wrote, "I like dog." So she, I'm guessing, liked the dog in the story that we were reading about, which is great that she was able to remember that word and write it down correctly, and she spelled it all right, which is awesome. This next student down here said dog, sled, snow, and pole. So that was main um, bold words from our story that the student was able to remember and then write down. So they were able to understand what was important, what was important, and pull that from the story and remember those important parts. So then the last person just wrote happy. So I wasn't expecting them to write a lot. I just wanted them to write down whatever they felt, and they were also able to scribble on which feeling they felt. So this was a great tool, and I will continue to keep this tool in the classroom for them to use at any point in the day. If they are upset, and let's say I'm teaching and I'm not able to stop what I'm doing and talk to them about what's wrong, they can go over to the Zen zone and write down what they're feeling and then give it to me. So I'm able to then know why they're upset and support them even when I'm teaching a lesson. Here's another emotional assessment in the middle that said, talk no to me. So I took that as maybe their partner didn't talk to them, and that made them feel sad. So I was able to then support them in the way of active listening and taking turns when speaking. Here was my field notes. This is something I took in the moment, and I was able to then write down every single thing that I was able to write down in that moment and then recall that later on. Here's my anecdotal notes. I use this to get more of a summary of what was happening in that moment. So I would do this after the fact and would just recall what I had saw and remembered from those turn and talks. And then I was able to also use this to refer to when figuring out supports I could use for those students, and maybe did those supports work, or do I need to tweak them and make them a better resource for those students. So here are some supports I implicated. So I tried to use some of the supports that were already implemented in my classroom, but just tweaking them a little bit to how I felt they would better support the students. So top middle, you'll see that this was a journal post that one of the students did, and I was able to then look at this journal and say, well, did the student understand what was being said, or were they having more trouble recalling what they had read? And so that was something I used every single day to look to see if the student was able to recall those things that they had learned in our story or during shared reading. To the right of that, you'll see some visuals I use. So with having so much knowledge in self-contained classrooms, visuals are huge, especially with those English language learners. So sometimes I feel it's better to show them a visual than to really say something to them, since they don't have that. I'm not able to fully know that they understood what I said. So like, are you okay? They can, and there was little visuals on it that said, yes, that had like a happy face, a sad face. So I was able to use a lot of those visuals to then support them without using so much verbiage with them. In the bottom left, you'll see the visuals that was on the piece of paper for each student. They were able to use that during journals, on writing, and other times of the day when they needed to write down words. That way they were able to recall the picture and how to spell that word in the story. And so bottom middle, you'll see a student using the fidget. This really helped a lot of the students. One of the students has very bad anxiety and would shake because she just couldn't understand what she was feeling. And so having that fidget to calm her body down really helped her to take her mind off of what she was feeling anxious about and then focus back on what we were doing. Bottom right is an example of the core board that I'm hoping to get in every single one of the students' hands. And so here are some of my sources that I used. Here are the sources that I used to better help me navigate the supports I use with my students in my research. Thank you so much.